be talking briefly about Weber's work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Let's start with a bit of background on Weber. Weber's father was in politics. He was very strict and obviously influenced Weber's ideas. Weber was much more pessimistic than Marx. Early interpretations of Weber saw him as opposed to Marx. However, those interpretations were done by Talcott Parsons, who downplayed Weber's analysis of conflict and power. Weber is characterized as a conflict theorist, but can also be seen as a social constructionist. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we address Du Bois and Du Bois' influence on Weber. We often say Weber was arguing with the ghost of Marx. Marx's work greatly influenced Weber. However, as Eddles and Appelruth state, Weber was responding to a crude reductionist version of Marxism. Weber departs from Marx on some points and agrees with him on many others. We'll read 3 of his works this semester: The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Class, Status, Party, and Bureaucracy. Let's think about what is meant by the title of Weber's work. What is the spirit of capitalism, and what does the Protestant ethic have to do with it? How does Weber revise Marx's work? In what ways is his work similar to Marx, and in what ways is it different? How successful is Weber in distinguishing his work from Marx's? According to Weber, why did the surge in capitalism occur after the 16th century? There's a great lecture by John Scarborough on YouTube regarding this, and I'm going to summarize his take just on the Protestant Reformation and share the link to his lecture. There's also a kind of cringy cartoon representation of what happens with Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation, and I will share that link as well, but fast forward that cartoon representation to about 3 minutes in, and you can see the representation there. Weber argued that many factors contributed to this surge in capitalism, the main one being the Protestant Reformation. So, what's the Protestant Reformation about? In the 1500s, Martin Luther begins challenging the idea of indulgences, paying for a path to heaven. He argues that any work, not just priestly work, is good. As we've already looked at with Emil Durkheim, Protestants emphasized an individual relationship with God, and this was different from Catholicism. So as this individual relationship is emphasized and indulgences are challenged, how are you to prove that you're in the book of life and going to heaven? People are anxious about this. They prove that they were worthy by being prosperous. So if they're prosperous, this is a sign that God is looking favorably upon them. Here we see Weber talking about the calling, the idea that each individual has a life task. So on page 188 in your text, Weber states, quote, "What God demands is not labor in itself, but rational labor in a calling. God blesseth his trade" is a stock remark about the good men who had successfully followed the divine hints. So if you're doing well with your trade or your calling, this is a good or godly sign. But you're not supposed to be spending the money on yourself, and you're not supposed to be idle. You should be following a rational method. And by doing that good work and seeing that good work pay off, you have proof that you're going to heaven. All of this makes up Weber's Protestant ethic. The ethical imperative to save and invest one's wealth would become the spiritual foundation for the spread of capitalism. That's what's meant by the spirit of capitalism. In other words, Weber does not mean to say that the Protestant ethic caused capitalism to happen, but that it created a spiritual foundation or belief system that allowed capitalism to spread. Capitalism was going to happen with or without the Protestant ethic, but it was helped along with the Protestant ethic. These are the seeds of capitalism laid by the Protestant churches. Now, what I want to offer this discussion is the question of how Weber is similar to and different from Marx. Let's start with how he is similar to Marx. Weber argues that a religious belief system intended to explain the path to eternal salvation paradoxically fueled the creation of a secular world in which, quote, material goods have gained an increasing and finally an inexorable power over the lives of men as at no previous period in history. Does this argument about material goods and inexorable power sound familiar? Is it any different from Marx's concept of fetishism of commodities? The difference is that Weber is making his argument about the future. Unlike Marx, Weber felt it was only going to get worse. Society is going to become increasingly rational, and we're all going to be caged by it. So Weber states, no one knows who will live in this cage in the future, or whether at the end of this tremendous development, entirely new prophets will arise, or there will be a great rebirth of old ideas and ideals, or if neither, mechanized petrification embellished with a sort of convulsive self-importance. For of the last stage of this cultural development, it might well be said, specialist without spirit, sensualist without heart, this nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. So for Weber, that rational planning that develops with the Protestant ethic and spurs capitalism on will survive, but religion won't. Society will become increasingly rationalistic and scientific. That methodological part of religion will be kept, but religious spirituality and other religious values will disappear. Religion will be replaced by science. Weber also does not significantly revise Marx's concept of alienation. Weber's ideas on this are strongest again when he's looking towards the future. So on page 192 in your text, Weber states, the order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition. On page 187 at the bottom, he talks about being forced to accept your labor. On page 185, he talks about the attitude of exerting the least amount of effort when you're working. This is the attitude of an alienated person. But here also, he is giving the answer to alienation. How does one continue going about such work? The answer is they have a calling. They must continue their work because they have a calling to God. The difference is that Weber is arguing that all of these issues come not from the base and even not fully from the superstructure, but an interaction of the two. The answer cannot be reduced completely to either. This is one of Weber's main contributions. How is Weber different from Marx? Religion. Weber states, for the saints' everlasting rest in the next world, on earth man must, to be certain of his state of grace, do the works of him who sent him. Not leisure and enjoyment, but only activity serves to increase the glory of God. Also, the emphasis on the ascetic importance of a fixed calling provided an ethical justification of the modern specialized division of labor. Is Weber saying here that religion is an opiate, just like Marx did? In some ways he is, but the key difference is that Weber argued religion could work both ways, not only to stifle revolution and change, but to foster it, spur it on as well. So religion is not always an opiate. Some other differences between Weber and Marx, and these are covered in your textbook by Eddles and Appelruth. Weber maintained that social life did not evolve according to some imminent or necessary law. So he didn't see history as ending in a utopian society as Marx did. 2. Eddles and Appelruth note, Weber contended that the development of societies could not be adequately explained on the basis of a single or primary causal mechanism. So again, it's not just the base, but other factors as well, an interaction of the base and superstructure. For Weber, it was not capitalism, but the process of rationalization and the increasing dominance of bureaucracies that threatened to destroy creativity and individuality. He presents his idea of the iron cage. So from your textbook, quote, the ascetic ideals lying at the heart of the Protestant ethic were carried into the practical affairs of economic activity and social life more generally. This unleashed the process of rationalization, disenchanting Western society and creating an iron cage from which the individual is left with little power to escape, end quote. Weber argues that it's not capitalism that causes alienation and all these other things, but bureaucracy. Yet Marx would argue that bureaucracy, the means to achieve greater efficiency, is ingrained in capitalism. It develops along with capitalism. The only difference is that for Weber, the source of bureaucracy is scientific ideas of rationalism, which have their roots in religion. Yet religion is lost over time, leaving behind only that rational method. That was one of his key concerns. How successful was Weber? Some of his predictions have been questioned. Weber thought science would replace religion, but this might not be the case. In fact, public trust in science varies. We haven't seen a huge increase in the public trust in science, and religion hasn't been completely replaced. People not only continue to practice organized religion, but spirituality has become popular. Younger generations may have rejected organized religion more, but they still practice spirituality, and they still report a connection to something larger than themselves. How successful was Weber in distinguishing his ideas from Marx? Weber reinforces the idea that any analysis must be multidimensional. We must understand the convergence of many movements and issues. Both the superstructure, ideas, and the base material conditions are important and combine to create the society we live in. He makes a methodological contribution with Verstehen, or understanding, social understanding. We should analyze the subjective meanings human actors attach to their actions with specific social and historical contexts. Here we see Weber's contribution to qualitative sociology and symbolic interaction. With Verstehen, Weber clearly opposes the reification of society. Now, when we discuss class status power, we will see Weber's contribution to the subjective elements in analysis of social class.